I have another video called Materialism versus Spirituality, where I briefly explain how materialism is diametrically opposed to spirituality. In other videos, I go over a long-form explanation of all this. But in that one, it's called Materialism or Spirituality, and it's like purple in the background on the thumbnail. Okay. And so, why did you need to know all those details? Because you could have seen it yourself. What are we talking about? Anyway, let's focus here. Okay, so we're talking about in this one, dualism versus spirituality. And so, while materialism is diametrically opposed to spirituality, because materialism, virtually like reductive materialism, is the idea that everything can just be reduced to the smallest parts and that there's, whole systems are nothing greater than the sum of their parts, and that there's not action, communication beyond space and time, as if everything is just locally, only affects each other locally instead of non-locally, which would be communication beyond space and time, which is what provides for that organizing principle. And so that's where I'd say materialism, reductive materialism, is diametrically opposed to spirituality. Okay, but dualism, in a lot of ways, my view is not dualism. My view on spirituality is not dualism, but dualism isn't diametrically opposed to spirituality like materialism is. And so, which is why, you basically have the fundamental ontological views of materialism, dualism, and idealism. So my view would be more idealism, but spirituality can be a part of idealism or dualism, but not materialism. That's kind of the point of the materialism versus spirituality video, right? And then, but what is dualism and how does dualism contrast with spirituality? And so really the idea here is that one thing that dualism posits is that, and what I'm going to particularly kind of argue is kind of a particular conception of dualism, modern religious dualism kind of thing, where people say they're spiritual, but they believe everything mainstream science says too, and think that they're just kind of compatible somehow. And so, really the idea here of dualism is that there is a material world that exists in itself, fundamentally devoid of consciousness, but that consciousness and spirituality are something separate. Materialism just says there's only the material world, and that consciousness is derivative of that. Idealism basically says what there is fundamentally consciousness, and then that consciousness perceives, the perception of a material world from a conscious entity is derivative. So that the material world is a derivative of consciousness. Dualism would say that they're each independently existing and neither is derivative of the other. And so the mainstream type of dualism today would be like, well, I believe in spirituality, but I also believe everything mainstream science says, would be kind of this idea that spirituality is separate, so that, there does exist matter in itself, but then that consciousness and the soul are something separate from matter in itself. And this isn't the view that I support, because what I think is happening here is that everything is fundamentally a manifestation from the infinite mind, and that, like I mentioned a little bit in the materialism versus spirituality view, is that everything comes out of this quantum vacuum, which is fundamentally beyond space and time and has that interconnection. And then the materialist view kind of denies that and will say, no, everything's just kind of its own independently existing physical material particle existing in itself, right? And then dualism would kind of hold to that and say that, spirituality is something separate. And dualism is the less thought through view. And it's the less logically consistent view. Whereas I find materialism absurd and ridiculous, I would say it's more logically consistent than dualism, because it realizes and thinks through kind of the implications of what it's saying. That if we're going to have a robust theory of everything, then that has to include consciousness. And so we can't just say, well, consciousness is something separate and it's not part of this. So materialism just reduces consciousness to the material and reduces and kind of eliminate spirituality. Whereas kind of the substance dualism approach would say that, well, yeah, we can try to understand everything, kind of goes along with the mainstream materialism, but says, but consciousness and spirituality are something separate, and it doesn't really have a way to explain that at all. So materialism tries to explain consciousness through material processes and eliminate spirituality. Substance dualism in this regard thinks that consciousness isn't explained by material process, but it's just something separate and unexplained entirely, along with spirituality, which, materialism denies, but dualism would say, well, no, there's something in spirituality, but has no way to explain how any of that works. Whereas my view of idealism would be more of explaining it through how everything is a manifestation coming out of that quantum vacuum in a back and forth constant feedback loop of kind of manifest form to the infinite potential beyond it, and everything is connected in that way through that infinite mind. I mean, there's a lot to explain there, and it's hard to just do it on these kind of videos, trying to make them short, but that would be more where you have to contrast materialism and a spirituality which directly oppose each other. But spirituality doesn't necessarily mean idealism. There can be a dualistic spirituality which isn't very well thought through and doesn't really understand what the hell it's talking about at all. And I'm going to make a lot more videos and a lot longer videos, probably, and a lot longer posts. I have actually written a bunch of stuff that goes in more detail of that, and I think I'm better at writing because I don't kind of ramble and I can think through and edit what I'm saying a little more. And so you should probably check those out. I'll put some links in the comments, actually, on that one. And I recommend checking those out. Thanks.